Imagine being stranded in the middle of nowhere, lost on a deserted island with no hope of escape. Your only shelter, your only source of comfort, burns to the ground in a merciless fire. Would you give up? Would you believe you were doomed? Or could this disaster be the very thing that saves you? This is the story of one woman's fight for survival, a tale of despair, resilience, and an unexpected twist of fate. How did she get here? How did she survive? And most importantly, how did the fire that destroyed her world become the very thing that saved her life? Stay tuned for The Fire Outbreak That Took Everything and Gave Her Freedom. Before we begin, let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? Let's see how far this story travels. Chapter 1, Into the Deep. The ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, an infinite expanse of blue beneath a sky smeared with streaks of gold and violet. The waves lapped gently against the sides of the boat, a rhythmic lullaby that had, until now, been a source of peace. The woman, Ava Carter, leaned against the rail, inhaling the salty air, letting the breeze tangle in her dark hair. She had always loved the ocean. It was her escape, her sanctuary, the place where she could be alone with her thoughts, away from the chaos of the world. This trip was supposed to be a simple voyage, a few days at sea, a chance to reconnect with herself. But nature had other plans. A sudden shift in the wind made her frown. The once friendly sky darkened, the colors swallowed by an ominous gray. The sea, so serene just moments ago, began to churn, waves rising with increasing aggression. Ava's stomach twisted as she turned toward the horizon. A wall of darkness loomed in the distance, thunderclouds swelling, lightning flickering like an unholy warning. The storm was coming fast, too fast. Her heartbeat spiked as she rushed to the boat's controls, gripping the wheel with white-knuckled hands. She had checked the weather forecast before setting out. There hadn't been any mention of a storm, but now the ocean raged, and she was in its path. The first gust of wind hit like a slap, nearly knocking her off balance. She scrambled to lower the sail, her fingers fumbling against the ropes. The boat lurched violently, water crashing over the sides. Rain pelted her skin like shards of glass, the temperature dropping sharply as the storm swallowed her whole. Lightning slashed across the sky, illuminating the chaos for mere seconds before plunging everything back into darkness. The waves towered above her like living beasts, slamming into the boat with terrifying force. The vessel groaned under the pressure, wood creaking as if crying out in pain. Ava fought to keep control, but the storm was merciless. A wave, larger than any before, rose from the depths like a monstrous hand reaching for her. She barely had time to brace before it crashed down, flipping the boat like it was nothing more than a toy. She was in the water before she even realized what had happened. The cold stole the breath from her lungs as she was dragged beneath the surface. Darkness swallowed her whole, salt burning her eyes, her throat. She kicked, clawed, struggled against the pull of the sea. The wreckage of her boat was barely visible through the chaos. Pieces of wood bobbed in the water like broken bones. She reached for anything, her fingers catching hold of a floating plank. Coughing, gasping, she clung to it, waves tossing her like a rag doll. Thunder roared above. The storm didn't care about her. The sea didn't care. She drifted, helpless, exhausted, until the blackness pulled her under once more. Chapter 2, Stranded and Alone. Ava woke with a start, coughing up seawater as her body convulsed with shivers. Her skin was ice cold, her muscles aching as though she had been crushed under the weight of the ocean itself. The sound of waves lapping against the shore filled her ears, a rhythmic whisper reminding her that she was still alive. She lay there for a moment, face down on something rough and grainy. Sand. Wet, warm sand. The realization hit her all at once. She had survived. Somehow, against all odds, the sea had carried her to land. With effort, she lifted her head, her vision blurry, the harsh sunlight stabbing through her skull like needles. She squinted, trying to make sense of her surroundings. A stretch of golden beach extended before her, curving around the edge of dense green jungle. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their thick canopy promising shade, but also an unsettling sense of the unknown. Ava forced herself onto her elbows, coughing again as she tried to gather her thoughts. Her boat, what was left of it, was nowhere in sight. Panic stirred in her chest. She was alone. She turned her gaze to the horizon. Endless ocean, no boats, no sign of human life. Just the vast, unbroken expanse of water that had nearly swallowed her whole. The full weight of her situation settled in. She was stranded. Her breathing quickened, fear creeping into her thoughts, but she clenched her jaw and pushed herself upright. Panicking wouldn't help. She needed to think, needed to survive. Shaky and exhausted, she stumbled toward the tree line. Her soaked clothes clung to her body, making every movement feel sluggish. She needed shelter, water, food, the bare necessities of survival. The jungle was thick and unwelcoming, but she pressed forward. She had no choice. Twigs snapped under her feet, the scent of damp earth filling her nostrils. The deeper she moved into the greenery, the more alive the island seemed. Birds chirping, insects buzzing, the occasional rustle in the underbrush that sent a chill down her spine. After what felt like an eternity of walking, she found a small clearing near a rock formation. It wasn't much, but it was something. She could make it work. With the sun sinking lower in the sky, she wasted no time. Using the few dry branches she could find, she fashioned a crude lean-to against the rocks. It wasn't sturdy, nor was it comfortable, but it was a start. By nightfall, she had managed to gather a handful of coconuts, their hard shells proving to be a frustrating challenge to crack open. She drank what little she could, and curled up beneath her makeshift shelter, the reality of her situation pressing down on her. The loneliness was suffocating, the silence deafening. As she stared up at the unfamiliar sky, she clung to one thought. I survived the storm. I can survive this. But deep down, she couldn't shake the question gnawing at her mind. For how long? Chapter 3. The Fire and the Fall. The days blurred together. Ava lost track of time, marking each sunrise with a scratch on a rock. Her body had adjusted to the rhythm of survival. Wake up, search for food, gather firewood, reinforce her shelter. It wasn't much, but it kept her occupied, kept her sane. She had managed to make fire using dry twigs and sheer determination. It had taken her days of trial and error, but when the first spark caught and the flames licked at the wood, she nearly cried. Fire meant warmth. It meant protection. It meant hope. And hope was all she had left. Each morning she climbed the highest rock formation she could find, scanning the horizon for any sign of a passing ship. But the ocean remained empty, mocking her silent pleas. Still, she refused to give up. On what she assumed was her 4th or 5th week, she decided to improve her shelter. Her makeshift lean-to was barely holding together, and with the rainy season possibly approaching, she needed something sturdier. Using large palm fronds, tree branches, and whatever debris she could find, she built herself a small hut against the rock wall. It wasn't perfect, but it gave her a sense of control, of power over her circumstances. For the first time since she washed up on the shore, she felt a flicker of pride. Then, one night, the unthinkable happened. The wind had been stronger than usual, howling through the trees and shaking her fragile shelter. Ava had retreated inside, huddled near her fire, trying to warm herself against the chill. Then she smelled it. Smoke. At first, she thought it was just her fire burning a little hotter than usual, but then she saw the glow creeping up the side of her hut, orange and hungry. Her stomach clenched with terror. The flames spread quickly, feeding on the dry palm fronds she had used for roofing. Within seconds, her entire hut was ablaze, the heat unbearable. Ava scrambled out, coughing, her vision blurred by smoke. Sparks danced in the air, embers floating like tiny fireflies before settling on the ground. She watched in horror as the shelter she had worked so hard to build collapsed in on itself, consumed by the inferno, all her efforts, her home, her firewood, gone. She fell to her knees, the weight of exhaustion and despair crushing her. Tears spilled down her cheeks, her body racked with sobs. The fire crackled in front of her, a cruel reminder of how easily everything could be taken away. She had fought so hard. For what? To have it all reduced to ashes? Ava clenched her fists, her voice breaking as she whispered into the darkness. Why? She had survived the storm, the wreck, the hunger. She had fought to stay alive. But now she felt truly defeated. For the first time, she wondered if she had been wrong to fight at all. She curled up near the smoldering remains of her home, the last warmth from the fire fading into the night. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. For the first time, she wasn't sure she wanted to find out. Chapter 4. Lost in Ashes. Ava woke to the scent of charred wood and damp earth. The fire had died sometime in the night, leaving behind a pile of blackened debris where her shelter had once stood. The air was thick with smoke, the embers still faintly glowing beneath the ashes. She didn't move. She barely breathed. Her body ached from sleeping on the cold, hard ground, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the weight pressing on her chest. This was it, the breaking point. For weeks she had fought. She had built, scavenged, survived. And now, in a single night, everything was gone. Ava rolled onto her back, staring up at the sky. The sun was rising, casting golden light over the island. A cruel irony. How could the world look so beautiful when she felt so empty? Tears pricked her eyes, but she had no more energy to cry. She had begged the universe for a sign, for some proof that she hadn't been abandoned. But what had she gotten? A fire that destroyed what little she had left. Maybe she wasn't meant to be saved. She forced herself to sit up, her limbs heavy, her mind sluggish. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but she ignored it. What was the point? Ava dragged herself toward the remains of her shelter, sifting through the ashes with numb fingers. There was nothing left to salvage, just a few unburnt sticks, some half-melted leaves. She let out a bitter laugh. "Guess that's it, huh?" she muttered, her voice hoarse from the smoke and the weight of her own despair. The silence answered her. She glanced at the horizon, as she had done every day, hoping, praying for a ship. Nothing, just the endless stretch of ocean, taunting her. Her hands balled into fists. "I can't do this anymore." Her thoughts turned dark, drifting to the waves lapping at the shore. If she waded in deep enough, if she let the current take her? Number. She squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head. That wasn't who she was. She had fought too hard, endured too much. If she was going to die here, it wouldn't be because she gave up. But she had no plan, no shelter, no hope. With a shaky breath she stood. She had to move, had to do something. She wandered toward the beach, her feet dragging through the sand. The ocean stretched out endlessly, but this time she didn't feel the same desperation. She just felt tired. As she sat down, watching the waves roll in and out, a thought struck her. The fire. She had seen the flames from miles away as they engulfed her hut. What if, just maybe, someone else had seen it too? The idea was ridiculous. She had no proof. But still, a small ember of hope flickered inside her, refusing to be snuffed out completely. Ava leaned back, resting her head against the sand. She would wait. Not because she believed a rescue was coming, but because she wasn't ready to stop fighting. Not yet. Chapter 5. The Rescue Signal. Ava didn't know how long she had been sitting there, staring at the ocean. Time felt irrelevant, just an endless cycle of waves crashing, the sun crawling across the sky, and her own thoughts swirling like a storm inside her head. The island was quiet, too quiet. The only sound was the gentle whisper of the wind and the distant cry of seabirds. The fire had taken everything, leaving nothing but ashes and the crushing weight of isolation. Then something changed. At first she thought she was imagining it, a low, distant hum, barely distinguishable from the wind. It was so faint she almost ignored it, chalking it up to her mind playing tricks on her. But then it grew louder. Ava sat up, her body going rigid. The sound wasn't in her head. It was real. She scrambled to her feet, heart pounding so violently she could hear it in her ears. She turned toward the horizon, her breath catching in her throat. A ship. For a moment, she didn't believe it. Her mind refused to process what her eyes were seeing. A real ship, large, moving steadily across the water. She staggered forward, her legs weak from exhaustion, but fueled by sheer desperation. She had to get their attention. She had to do something. Frantically, she waved her arms, shouting at the top of her lungs, even though she knew they couldn't hear her from this distance. Her voice cracked, her throat raw. "Please, look this way. Please." Then she saw it, movement on the deck, a glint of binoculars catching the sunlight. They had seen her. Ava dropped to her knees, a choked sob escaping her lips. She didn't know if she was laughing or crying, maybe both. The ship altered its course, turning toward the island. The sound of the engines grew stronger, the wake behind it slicing through the water like a beacon of hope. Minutes felt like hours as she waited, watching the vessel draw closer. She could make out figures now, people pointing, moving with urgency. Then a smaller boat was lowered into the water. A rescue team. She stumbled toward the shoreline, waves rushing over her feet as she waded in, desperate to meet them halfway. The closer they got, the more her mind swirled with emotions, relief, disbelief, gratitude. As the rescue team reached her, strong hands helped her onto the boat. She barely registered the voices around her, the murmurs of reassurance, the questions about how long she had been here. One of the men, dressed in a uniform, crouched beside her. "We saw the fire last night," he said. "That's what led us here." Ava's breath hitched. The fire. The same fire that had destroyed everything, the fire that had broken her, had saved her. She looked back at the island, at the scorched remains of her shelter. She had seen it as a punishment, a sign of her failure. But in reality, it had been her rescue signal all along. She let out a shaky breath, closing her eyes for a moment. She was going home. Chapter 6. Freedom in Flames. As the rescue boat pulled away from the island, Ava sat in silence, watching the shoreline shrink into the distance. The place that had nearly broken her, that had tested her strength in ways she never imagined, was now nothing more than a fading memory against the vast expanse of ocean. She shivered slightly, though whether from exhaustion, relief, or the reality settling in, she wasn't sure. One of the rescuers draped a warm blanket around her shoulders, snapping her out of her daze. "How long have you been stranded?" a man with a kind face asked. Ava opened her mouth, but her throat felt dry, her mind struggling to grasp time. I don't know," she admitted, her voice hoarse. "Weeks? Maybe a month." The crew exchanged glances, murmuring something about how lucky she was to be alive. But Ava knew better. Luck had nothing to do with it. She turned her gaze back to the island one last time. The charred remains of her shelter were barely visible now, but she could still see the smoke lingering in the sky. It was strange. That fire had felt like the ultimate betrayal, the universe taking one final thing from her just to remind her how powerless she was. But it wasn't a punishment. It had been a signal. The fire had saved her. She let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. The irony of it all. The gentle hum of the boat's engine was soothing, rocking her into a trance as the ship came into view. A large vessel, a beacon of safety. As they pulled alongside it, Ava felt strong arms helping her up onto the deck. More people surrounded her, offering water, food, medical attention. But all she could do was breathe, taking in the simple relief of knowing she was finally safe. A medic examined her, shining a light into her eyes. "You're dehydrated, exhausted, but you'll be okay. Okay. The word felt foreign, unreal. For so long, she had been trapped in survival mode, every second of every day spent trying to stay alive. But now what? She was going home. The thought felt heavy and unfamiliar. The world she had left behind felt like another lifetime. Would she still fit into it? Or had she changed too much? As if sensing her unease, one of the rescuers spoke. "You did good out there," he said. "Most people wouldn't have lasted as long as you did." Ava let those words settle. She had survived. Not just the storm, not just the island. She had survived herself, the doubt, the fear, the hopelessness. And now she had a second chance. She glanced toward the horizon, where the sky was beginning to shift into soft shades of pink and gold. A new day was coming, and for the first time in a long time, Ava wasn't afraid to meet it.